Hi guys, my name is Michaela. I am currently 30 weeks pregnant and I am a mom of 3. I have also had 2 pregnancy losses in the past, so I have a lot of experience with taking pregnancy tests, finding out that I'm pregnant, etc. And I wanted to kind of go over how I knew I was pregnant in all of my pregnancies before taking tests and before missing my period. These were like my top symptoms of how I found out, and I just knew. It was like I woke up one morning and I'm like, I'm pregnant. Like, it was kind of like a clicking moment every single time for every pregnancy. The first symptom that I would feel is frequent urination, and it wasn't similar to like a UTI because it would be a large amount of pee at one time and I would have to pee often, and it was always noticeable the next morning. Like, I would start to feel it at nighttime where I would need to pee maybe 2 or 3 times. Now, if you're someone who maybe already goes to the bathroom frequently at nighttime, you might not notice this symptom right away. But for me, I have a really good pelvic floor. I've never had any urination problems unless I were to have a UTI, and so it was very noticeable for me from the very beginning that, man, I know that I peed 3 times last night and I don't do that, I must be pregnant. Like, that's just always what pops into my head. And so that's kind of what clues me in that I need to buy tests or order tests, and then I go from there. Now, the second symptom that I always get is extreme fatigue. Now, this is so different than any other fatigue you have experienced. I wouldn't even consider this the same type of fatigue as when you have a new baby. It's just different. Like, it just goes overnight, where all of a sudden the next day you literally just can't get out of bed. You are so exhausted. You get out of bed and an hour later you're like falling asleep in your chair. Like, that's the type of exhaustion that I start feeling at the beginning of my pregnancies, and it's really noticeable within those first few days that my body is starting to make HCG and all the other pregnancy hormones that start going out of whack. I always feel such an extreme amount of exhaustion. And again, it's definitely different if you've had children before. It's like a different type of exhaustion than staying up all night with like a newborn or doing things with kids all the time. Like, it's just different. Like, there is no comparison for me. Not that you don't get exhausted with taking care of a newborn, but I feel like your alertness is on overdrive once you have a newborn, because you could be exhausted and then something happens and it's like you wake up right away, you know? Like, there's nothing waking you up from this type of exhaustion, like coffee, food, nothing. Like, you just feel like you need to go to sleep, and sometimes you start falling asleep when you're doing something. That's how it always is for me. Now, those 2 symptoms combined are like my telltale signs, which lead me to buy tests. I always start taking tests when I haven't missed my period yet, and it's just because I have felt those symptoms, in addition to feeling kind of dizzy. So this isn't like an extreme dizziness, like I'm not gonna pass out, but it's just kind of like you're just not feeling all there. Like, you stand up and it's just kind of like you're kind of spaced out type of dizzy. That's how I would compare it to. And I think that, you know, you are making a lot more blood. Your blood volume's a lot different. So when you stand up from sitting down, and sometimes you need a second, that's the kind of dizziness that I would start to feel. And then before I would miss my period, I would always feel sick to my stomach, and I would end up, I wouldn't throw up in every single pregnancy, but I would always feel like I needed to at the beginning. Like those first few days, I would always feel like I needed to throw up. And normally the day that I would miss my period, that was like the last thing. It was like, oh, now I feel sick. These symptoms combined, I'm definitely pregnant. I didn't start taking pregnancy tests before my missed period until I was in my 4th pregnancy. I would test, I think it was like 8 DPO, so 8 days past ovulation. If you aren't sure of when that is, you could always use like a pregnancy calendar and put in your period range and when you would have expected like your next period or when your last period happened, and it could kind of give you an ovulation range. Now it's not always like to the T unless you've been tracking it for a long time, but it will give you kind of an idea of when you were supposed to ovulate. So I always got positives 8 days past ovulation, and this wasn't like bright smack in your face positive. It's like makes my husband think that it's not positive because it's so faint. Like you have to really have line eyes to see it that early, and by line eyes I mean like you could see that line form no matter how faint it is, and it's different from like an evap line. It has some color to it. I always use the cheapy tests to do that. You could use Walmart tests, or you could order like the cheapy packs off of Amazon, and that was even with my ectopic and with my miscarriage. I was always able to get that line. With my 2 previous pregnancies before that, I didn't test until the day that I missed my period, and I had like basically dye stealers those times when I tested. This pregnancy, it was like a really normal, healthy pregnancy. I also got a dye stealer when I missed my period. So that's like another telltale sign. Sometimes when you first find out that you're pregnant for the first time, you think that like there could be some sort of a false positive, or that maybe it isn't like that accurate, you know. And yes, it is important to go in and see your doctor just to confirm everything. Otherwise, that's like a pretty good sign that you are pregnant. There are not many other common things that could cause you to produce HCG. Now, another symptom that I would experience typically before the rest of the symptoms that I would list, but at the same time, I wouldn't know that that was like what that meant until I start feeling those other symptoms. And it's like a certain type of cramping that you start to feel, and this is when the egg is like attaching, like it's making its spot. You feel a certain type of cramping. It can almost feel, depending on, you know, who you are, but this is how it always felt to me, like I was going to start my period. It was just kind of like a twinge, crampiness. It wasn't in a general spot. Ovulate, sometimes people could get crampiness, but when the egg would implant, I would feel that implantation cramping as well. And the key part here is that you never actually start your period with this crampiness. So you kind of feel like you're going to start your period, but then you don't. And then you start feeling like the peeing or the nausea and the dizziness. Then that's when you could be like, oh, I'm probably pregnant. Of course, you won't know for sure until you get that positive test, unless you're like really experienced with it. Me, I knew always before I would get the test. It was always really obvious to me. Now, once you have felt all these symptoms combined, whether you have had pregnancies or not, I think kind of in the back of most women's mind, they're kind of thinking, I must be pregnant, you know, like I'm feeling all these weird symptoms. And sometimes your mind can trick you in a way to thinking that you're pregnant when you are feeling certain symptoms and then you start your period. But I think it's also really important that even if you've had these symptoms and then you start what you think is your period, that you take a pregnancy test, because sometimes women could have bleeding early on in their pregnancies, like I have, and it can almost seem like you had a light period or some spotting, which brings me to my next symptom, and that is spotting that can happen anywhere from when you had your implantation, which would be your implantation bleeding. This is not dark blood, it's normally just a little bit of spotting, and this isn't like dark blood. It shouldn't be like terribly noticeable, but you might see a little bit of pink when you wipe, or maybe just a little bit of pink discharge. It's not an excessive amount, so that's something that you could keep an eye out. Also, another really common thing, if you are finding out that you are pregnant after your missed period, a very common symptom of pregnancy is a hematoma. So a hematoma is kind of like a blood clot. Sometimes we just don't know why it forms, and they're normally very small. Now these hematomas, since they are blood, you can and maybe will bleed from them, and this is not a symptom that you're miscarrying, and it doesn't have to be a symptom of like an ectopic or anything like that, so don't worry. If you do have any bleeding though early in your pregnancy, you do need to go see your doctor, especially if you don't know what blood type you are, because if you have any sort of spotting, bleeding or anything, and you are Rh negative like myself, I have O negative blood, my husband has positive blood, I have to get what's called a RhoGAM shot. They will also most likely do an ultrasound on you just to make sure that there is in fact a baby forming. I don't want you to worry. Normally hematomas, in my experience, I've had them in every single pregnancy, they don't cause pain or cramping whatsoever. You will see a small amount of blood. If it's a small hematoma, it's not a lot. It's like some spots on your underwear, spots on a pad, maybe you wipe and there's some blood, and you just don't need to freak out, because if you aren't having any other negative symptoms, it doesn't mean that you're having a miscarriage. Just go get yourself checked out so that you could get yourself that shot if you need it. They could check to make sure that the baby's forming, and most of the time they will tell you that you just have a hematoma. Normally this doesn't put any restrictions on your pregnancy, and you just go about your pregnancy as normal. You might experience some more bleeding until the hematoma dissolves completely. Sometimes when it dissolves, it almost kind of like the blood dissipates inside of you and your body kind of absorbs it. So you might not even experience any bleeding at all with the hematoma. But it is very common in your early pregnancy for most women to have one. Another symptom that I have experienced just this past pregnancy, and this was around 6 weeks. This is towards the end of when I'm going to be talking about symptoms, because after about the 6-week period, I feel like this gets into more like first trimester symptoms, and those could be a little bit different than maybe figuring out that you're pregnant. So another symptom that I felt, which goes aligned with the hematoma that I was talking about, my hematoma was larger than a typical hematoma, and it was very worrying and it was very scary, because I had, this might be a trigger to hear, just letting you know, I had gushes of blood from this hematoma, and it was not like the typical normal spotting that most women will get with the hematoma, since they are very common. It is not very common to have a larger hematoma. My hematoma, I don't know how big it was before it had ruptured, but it did partially rupture, and it caused a large amount of bleeding. So I was bleeding probably after, so I was bleeding a lot when it first happened. It was gushing out of me, and it was very scary because I was for sure like hemorrhaging. It was, I had clots, and it was very liquidy pink fluid at one point where I like soaked my pants completely. My underwear was soaked. The car seat was soaked with blood because there was so much of it. When I got to the emergency room, there was blood still like running down my legs onto the floor. It was puddling. It was a lot of blood. I found out that there was a hematoma, but it was larger. Now, I don't know how big it was before it had partially ruptured, but after it had partially ruptured, I found out that my hematoma was 5 inches, which is very large. Normally, a large hematoma would be considered like maybe like 3 or 4 centimeters. That's a good sized hematoma, but mine was like 5 inches by 3 inches, and so it was very large, and it caused a lot of bleeding to happen, and it was a very scary experience. But I just wanted to mention this because the first thing that popped into my head after having a previous miscarriage and a previous ectopic, and it was very early in my pregnancy, being like just at 6 weeks, was that my baby was gone. You know, like I thought I was having a miscarriage or some sort of like abruption happened, something very horrible, and it wasn't. So this can happen. It's not common, and when you experience a large amount of bleeding like this, yes, you need to go to the emergency room because it could be very dangerous for yourself, especially if the bleeding isn't coming from something like a hematoma. But I just wanted to state this to add some reassurance to those of you who do end up having a large amount of bleeding or like large gushes of like pink bloody fluid early on, that it doesn't automatically mean that there is something wrong with you or your baby, and to try to stay positive about things. I am sorry if any one of you have had those symptoms and it ended up terrible, but I think it's really important though to try to keep a positive outlook about the beginning of your pregnancy, because pregnancy anxiety is very real and it could get very bad when you go into your first trimester. And that's where I'm going to leave the video here. Pregnancy anxiety kind of gets you into more of your first trimester pregnancy symptoms. Overall, those are all of my symptoms though that I experienced from 8 days post-ovulation until I was 6 weeks, which I wanted to include up to 6 weeks just because I feel like some women, you know, maybe you don't keep track of your cycle as well, or you have a lot going on, or you have an irregular cycle, and you may not find out until you're closer to 6 weeks. So I wanted to include those symptoms in there just so that you could kind of get a better idea of what to expect once you are past when you should have missed your period. But I hope you liked this video about the first symptoms, about how I knew I was pregnant before even taking a test, and pregnancy symptoms that could be normal and abnormal up until about the 6 week mark. Again, my name is Michaela. I am currently 30 weeks pregnant today. I have 3 children, ages 6, 3, and 21 months now. So if you want to see mommy lifestyle videos, mommy vlogs, I do post almost every single day. Go ahead and give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and I will talk to you guys later. Bye.